Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me Professor Andy Spalding. Andy, first of all, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here, man.
Andy, I've wanted to do this podcast with you for quite some time, and I think now is propitious a time as it can be, and it's around your work to help the Paris Olympic Committee for the Paris Olympics 2024, both in the area of human rights and anti-corruption. So, with that short and sweet introduction, why don't you tell us, how did you get involved in this project?
Great question, Tom. Thanks. By luck, by accident, like most of us in our careers, most good things happen this way. But I had been working on anti-corruption law for a long time, as you know, came to be interested in the way that anti-corruption reform were coinciding with the hosting of a mega sporting event. Brazil, South Korea, I think it's happened in a big way. And from there started cultivating a relationship with people in France, knowing that they were hosting the 2024 event. And I think I was just in the right place at the right time because some remarkable, I think, historic things are happening here.
I certainly agree with you in terms of the historic nature of the events. We're going to talk about perhaps an under the radar set of historic events that happened in Qatar in the most recent World Cup. And I really want to hear that story from you because it's one that really needs to get out. But we're here to talk about Paris a little bit. So could you tell us, after you were in the right place at the right time, which means when preparation meets opportunity, luck occurs, and you were prepared and the opportunity was right, how did you interact with the committee, or what did they task you to do?
So it's not so much that I've been tasked by the committee to perform functions, but I have been talking to them and to the committee itself, the organizing committee. But really my work has been more focused around FCPA, the French anti-corruption agency, working with them to help think about the broader impact of the work they're doing. It's interesting the way people in the trenches can be working mightily and not ever have the space to take a step back and recognize, wow, how does this fit into a broader historical trajectory? What's going on here? How are we contributing to this? But FCPA has done amazing work. They also in the right place at the right time. France was awarded the games, awarded the rights to host 2024 at the moment that FCPA was created. And so it became an opportunity as France now has this new anti-corruption law, FCPA, and we have this new anti-corruption compliance agency, FCPA, and we've just been awarded the rights to host the 2024 event. Maybe this is a moment. Maybe this is an opportunity to use the Olympics to push through some of the reforms that we're already thinking about, that we're already envisioning for France. And FCPA has very much done that.
So it's really interesting, the convergence of Sapontu, FCPA, obviously a major enforcement action involving Airbus that if it did turn heads, it made people aware of the French anti-corruption prosecutors and the incredible work they did on that case. But the mega sporting events, they're really almost above nations. They're truly international in scope. And here, I mean, the Olympic Games, the World Cup, some golf tournaments, and certain other events that literally transcend the globe. So how were you able to connect really the work FCPA has done and Sapondu to the mega event of the Paris Olympics or mega sporting events?
Sure. So by my read, I think France represents a pivot to a new era. I think we're coming out of a period of about 25 years where we've had recurring systemic corruption scandals. We all know the stories. We all know that some of the guilty parties. We think of Qatar and Russia and Brazil and so forth. We might forget that it's also Japan, also Germany, and the era of scandal, I would say, started right here in the United States. 1998, the Salt Lake City 2002 Winter Olympics bribery scandal. Many of your listeners might recall. But France is, I think, unwittingly, hardly aware of the way that they are heralding a new era in which we have international best practices being applied to this event. We have host countries like France innovating, designing bespoke frameworks that can do good work. We're developing these frameworks and these initiatives not in reaction to scandal, as has so often occurred in history, but actually proactively. Before we have a scandal, before we have a mess, we're just adopting these reforms. And they are reforms that are not just going to reduce, manage risk and reduce the likelihood of a scandal, but actually go beyond that and leave lasting positive impacts in the host country. And that's what I think is part of maybe the most important or most inspiring part of the French story, is the way France is going to be able to say they are better off in their anti-corruption norms, practices, framework, because they hosted the Olympics. And that then is a concept that we can take to future hosts. How are you going to leave a positive, lasting impact in your host country? How is your jurisdiction going to be better off on anti-corruption issues or human rights issues because of what you did with these events?
There was certainly the correct tone at the top of the organization, but you went much deeper. You went into a very tactical approach in some issues. And I know because I was a part of some of those discussions.
Mhm.
So really, you took it down to detailed policies and procedures for the Paris Olympic Committee. Could you talk about some of that work, both in human rights and in anti-corruption compliance?
Sure. So I mentioned that 2017, a lot happened. There's an additional element that I hadn't mentioned yet. So 2017, Sapin-2 takes effect. A FA is created. The IOC awards the Olympic Games to France at this moment. And the IOC that year introduced a new contractual provision into its host city contract. Now, the host city contract, the contract between the IOC and the host, to include the city, the National Olympic Committee, and the organizing committee, the entity that's set up to put on the event. And we've had these contracts for years, and they're big omnibus contracts. But starting in 2017, that is starting with the 2024 event, this contract has a clause which requires the host to adopt anti-corruption compliance and to adopt human rights due diligence. So France is the first country that had to wrestle with that new contractual obligation. They're basically setting a precedent for future hosts. Los Angeles 2028, same contractual provision. 32, Brisbane, same contractual provision. And so the question becomes, what can the host city do to make this new contractual obligation meaningful? I think France, knowingly or unknowingly, has done a ton to make it meaningful by the innovative initiatives that they've adopted and the impact they're having.
I come out of the energy industry and I saw literally an explosion of not simply FCPA enforcement, but FCPA compliance from the business perspective. So meaning that what drove compliance down the supply chain of vendors were the big boys saying, you want to do business with us, you have to have a compliance program and we're going to come look in. We're going to audit it. You can't just say you have one. Here you have a similar concept where the International Olympic Committee is required by contract with the Paris Olympic Committee, or the host city, as you refer to it, to have both of these components. I find it incredibly interesting that this is not a regulatory or some sort of legal requirement, but this is actually a commercial term.
The commercial term, it's contractual. It's asking the host city to do more than its laws might require. Now, of course, in France, we have Sapin-2, but this is fascinating to me. Sapin-2 did not apply to the organizing committee for the Olympic Games. Sapin-2 applies to certain public entities and certain private entities, but the organizing committee, which is basically a nonprofit, fell outside the jurisdictional scope of Sapin-2. So we can do two things now. We can say, heck, we've got this new anti-corruption reform movement in France, but we're going to kind of bracket aside the Olympics. Or do what France did, which is to amend the law, amend the statutes, to put the organizing committee under the jurisdiction of Sapin-2 and under the jurisdiction of a FA. So France wanted this to happen. France was taking proactive steps to ensure that what the IOC envisioned here would have that ripple effect all the way through its Olympic preparation. And so once the organizing committee is under the jurisdiction of Sapin-2 and a FA, what does that mean? That means that a FA is there to help the organizing committee design its compliance program, which it did. And then once that compliance program is in place, a FA will conduct periodic audits of the compliance program, which has happened. And so you have this level of rigor from a anti-corruption compliance agency that is unique in the world, bringing that rigor to the event. And I would say it's had positive effect.
Could you explain to our audience a little bit about the difference between a FA and, say, the Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchange Commission in their approach to exactly what you described, where a FA might come and oversee audit or at least discuss with the company, discuss with the City of Paris Organizing Committee how to do this and then take a look at it.
Yeah, sure. So I think the core difference is that a FA is not an anti-corruption investigative body, and it does not think of its mission as punitive. So a FA was created with Sapende. It's a dedicated anti-corruption compliance agency. Its purpose is to develop anti-corruption compliance standards and then to help private and public entities implement those standards. Now, that in turn assumes a difference with the Sapende framework, which is that unlike the US or the UK or Brazil, there is a freestanding requirement that these organizations adopt a compliance program. We don't just incentivize compliance. And then once an organization is under investigation, ask, did you have a compliance program? What kind of benefit should you get now from it? France takes a different approach and says, we're just going to require compliance programs of these classifications of entities. So once you have that, then you have a FA. So now a FA, what is its mission? To help these organizations implement these compliance programs. And FA, from the earliest days, decided it was not going to wield the maximum extent of its punitive power. It thought of itself more as an educational office. Its job was to help educate companies, government agencies on how to do compliance. And so it really tried to build more of a collaborative relationship with the corporate sector. Now, there are some tensions and there's some skepticism and so forth, and not everyone loves everything that a FA is doing, that's for sure. But not an adversarial relationship, and it's not a punitive relationship. So when a FA comes into the organizing committee and says, we want to help you, that lands a little differently than it would if the DOJ comes into your company and says, we want to help you.
Ronald Reagan saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help would not occur in the United States, at least in anti-corruption compliance. Andy, let me change the focus a little bit to something I alluded to earlier, which is Qatar. And you and I have had some discussions over the past several months about their response or their program around anti-corruption. And I have to say, it's very under the radars. Certain people know about it and it's not hidden, but it's not really been as publicized as perhaps it could or should have been. So could you tell us what impressed you about what Qatar did around these issues?
Yes. So I will tell you how I got involved with Qatar. I was at the OECD giving a talk about France, about what we're talking about right now. And afterwards, a gentleman whom I did not know, a man named Mahmoud Tabu, comes up to me and in the most polite way he could manage, read me the Riot Act for not realizing that the whole idea of a megasport legacy, of the concept that country could use megasports to push through anti-corruption and human rights reform, France actually didn't invent that idea. Qatar did. And so I spent then a couple of years really trying to understand what Qatar did. And I want to make clear that though the human rights problems, the crisis that occurred in Qatar was real, some of what was reported about it was, I think, not entirely accurate. By and large, that crisis was real. What most of us don't know is that Qatar then used all that negative publicity around labor problems to push through a series of labor reforms at the national legislative level. Qatar, in effect, the hosting of the FIFA World Cup as a lever to push through human rights reforms. And so at the end of the day, Qatar can say its labor law framework at the national level, not just to the World Cup or to sports, but its national labor law framework is completely different and much more in line with international best practices and with the ILO. And so we can ask questions, are these changes going to last? And time will tell. But it is certainly true that Qatar, I think, marks a transition out of the old era into the new era. Qatar had the corruption allegations, Qatar had the human rights scandals, but Qatar also leaned into the criticism in ways that Russia, China did not, and used this spotlight as a moment that it can capitalize on to push these reforms. So you've got minimum wage and worker safety and grievance mechanism and the prohibition on the confiscation of passports, etc. All these reforms we see in Qatar. So we can say Qatar is a different place moving forward because it hosted the World Cup.
That really leads to the next area or final area I wanted to explore with you, which is, can we use what Qatar did? Can we use what you and your colleagues helped the Paris Organizing Committee create moving forward with some of these other mega world sports events?
It's a fascinating question, and I would like to think we can. I think we have reason to believe that we can see now an accumulation of knowledge, experience, best practices that can be passed from host to host. I was just listening to a gentleman from the United Nations who oversees their corruption in sports work, and he said that until recently, we were reinventing the wheel with every single event. The hosts were not talking to each other. There wasn't this passing on of a baton, and it was inefficient. It was ineffective. But I think now we see France, 2024. We have France is likely to receive the rights to host the 2030 Winter Olympics. That's going to be announced in July, we all expect. So you'll see that building, that accumulation of practice and knowledge and experience there. Then you have the United States hosting the 2028 Los Angeles Summer Olympics, 2026 World Cup I just blew over. And then what we also expect to hear in July is that it will host the 2034 Salt Lake City Olympic. Again, the Olympics coming back to the birthplace of corruption scandal, which is a beautiful story. And so what can the United States learn from the French experience? This sapin de AFA framework doesn't really transfer to the United States. We don't have a freestanding compliance requirement, of course, as your listeners well understand. We don't have the analog to AFA. So how do we create a comparable level of rigor in our anti-corruption procedure and practice? With these mega sporting events, the State Department is calling this next decade our most important decade in mega sports because we're hosting the events I just mentioned, also the 2031 Rugby World Cup. It's all coming to the United States. And so we can either collaborate with France, collaborate with Australia, who's hosting 2032 Summer Olympics in Brisbane, and create a collective body of, again, knowledge and experience and practice that can be tailored to different jurisdictions, and come out of this decade really in a radically different place than we've been since the modern Olympics were started.
So that actually leads me back to my energy industry example, because it strikes me that perhaps the institutional knowledge that's now garnered by the International Olympic Committee could be used similar to what happened in the energy industry when a Halliburton, when a Baker Hughes, when a somebody would subcontract with a supplier. They'd send a compliance person over to look at their compliance program and help them get it up to speed. And if the International Olympic Committee has the institutional knowledge based upon the work you and others have done in Paris and then Brisbane and other jurisdictions going forward, there could be a rather robust set of knowledge brokers who could really help Salt Lake City or any other jurisdiction put these programs in place without sort of the AFA oversight that we've seen in France.
I think that's right. I think partly that will be brokered by the IOC, but it's also going to require stakeholders. It's going to require the companies that are doing business with the event. It's going to require NGOs. It's going to require commentators like yourself to collaborate. We got to get people talking to each other. We've got to get the France folks over here talking to us. We need to have conferences and things. The IOC is just perennially under-resourced. Good people over there trying to do good stuff. But I think it's going to require a much broader based effort to build these connections and to inherit this knowledge to pass it along. It's a fascinating challenge, I think. We've got 10 years here in the United States. We've got all kinds of expertise and goodwill around anti-corruption compliance. Can we now collaborate with other countries to build a body that leaves a legacy, not just in the United States, but leaves a legacy for the Olympic movement and for mega sports, for FIFA as well?
Seems like to me some university is crying out to host this event. Who might be interested?
I think there's room. I think there's room for us. I think there's room for others. But yes, we all need to be our connectors. You've done this work, Tom, as you mentioned. You were working with a group of us in an international group and trying to flesh out this new contractual provision and give some guidance to the IOC. In the next 10 years, there's going to be tons of work like that to do. And listeners to this podcast may have opportunities to contribute in some way.
Andy, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I did want to ask if our listeners wanted to perhaps connect with you to continue this discussion. what might be the best way for them to do so?
Absolutely. Find me my email. I'm at the University of Richmond School of Law. If you just Google Andy Spalding, Richmond Law, you'll find me. My email address is aspaldin, no G, at richmond.edu. Please contact me. I'd love to collaborate with people. Again, this needs to be a grassroots thing. This needs to be not a thing imposed by the IOC. It needs to be a thing that we as hosts of multiple events embrace. And if we do, I think we can do remarkable things.
Andy, thanks again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Same here, Tom. Thanks so much.